Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from Australia when a young girl just suddenly disappeared while she was cycling home from a shopping trip one day in 1987. A police search quickly ensued to try and find her and bring her home. But tragically, this search would not result in the outcome that everyone was hoping for. When less than a week after she vanished, this case went from being a missing persons inquiry to a murder investigation. And the hunt was on to find the killer, or killers, I should say. Pretty quickly, the police were able to identify two top suspects in this homicide. The evidence seemed to point directly to them as being the perpetrators, and upon looking further into them and piecing this case together, the police uncovered just how dark and depraved these two monsters were and how calculated and premeditated this crime was. This week we are talking about a killer couple who had been literally planning to kidnap and take the life of an innocent young child to satisfy their twisted fantasies, and on the 27th of November 1987 they finally turned those fantasies into a reality. Join me as we delve into the heartbreaking case of Sian Kingi. But quickly before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This case is about the murder of a young girl and it contains heavy themes such as the rape and sexual assault of a child, paedophilia, and topics such as domestic violence and suicide are also briefly mentioned. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 3.5 decades now to late 1987 in Noosa Heads, which is a little coastal town located in Queensland in Australia. And this is Sian Kingi. She was a 12-year-old girl who lived in Noosa Heads with her family. Sian was born on the 16th of December 1974 to her parents Barry and Linda Kingi, and I believe she was their only child. I couldn't find any information online about any siblings, so I think it was just her and her parents, and the family were originally from New Zealand and Shan was of Maori descent. Although she was an only child, Shan always had a lot of friends. She was very popular amongst her peers at school. She attended the Sunshine Beach State School in Queensland and she was in grade 7, and she was definitely someone who stood out in school, shall we say. Shan was such a beautiful little girl. She had this lovely long blonde hair and she was actually very tall for her age. She was definitely one of the tallest amongst the other girls in her school, which made her very good at netball, one of her favourite sports. Shan was a very sporty young girl in general, but yeah, she particularly enjoyed netball because she had that advantage of her height. Obviously being taller meant that she could easily reach the net and score. Shan was described as being a very gentle and lovely young girl. She was also said to be quite shy and quiet at times, but as I said, she was still very popular. She loved spending time with her friends, and actually she was very excited in the lead up to this case taking place because it was one of her friends' birthdays coming up and they were hosting a birthday party, which Shan was obviously very excited to attend. She'd been planning her outfit for this party, and actually her and her mum Linda had agreed to go out shopping together to buy some fabric for this dress or this skirt that Shan was going to wear, and that happens to be exactly what Shan was doing on the day that this case occurred. The date was the 27th of November 1987. It was a Friday and a school day for Shan, so she'd been to school, she'd had a good normal day, and then when school ended that afternoon, she and her mother Linda went shopping together at the Noosa Fair shopping centre. They went to a fabric shop. Shan picked out the material that she wanted for her party outfit because the party was happening in just 2 days' time on the Sunday. And then once they had finished shopping at around 4:30 p.m, Shan and her mother actually separated because you see Shan had her bicycle with her that day, her yellow 10-speed bike, and so she decided to cycle in one direction to get back home and her mother Linda was walking home along another route. The route that Shan was taking took her through Pinnaroo Park in Noosa Heads. It was a route that she was very familiar with and it should have only taken her about 4 minutes to get back home. So Shan said goodbye to Linda. She said, quote, "See you at home, mum," and with that she took off on her bicycle. However, as it would turn out, she never made it back. 12-year-old Sian Kingi never returned home. At some point along her route, she just mysteriously disappeared. Of course, when Shan's mother Linda got back and she realised that Shan wasn't there, she was confused because Shan should have been home by now. She should have got back before her mother because obviously she was on her bike and her mother was on foot. So where was she? Linda did think initially that perhaps Shan had bumped into some school friends during her journey and she was just chatting to them or something. However, time continued to pass and there was still no sign of her. And naturally, Linda started to become more and more concerned. And so she picked up the phone and she started calling all of Shan's friends, asking if she was with any of them or if they had seen her, but none of them had. Linda waited for a couple of hours, just hoping that soon enough Shan would walk through the front door, but she never did. And when Linda's husband Barry, Shan's father, got back from work, he and Linda immediately went out and they headed to Pinaroo Park because, as I mentioned, Shan's route home took her through the park. So they wanted to see if for some reason she was still there. And whilst there was no sign of Shan herself in the park, Linda and Barry did find their daughter's bike, her yellow bike. It was just lying on the ground beside the bike track. It looked like it had just been abandoned, which instantly made alarm bells ring for Barry and Linda. As I'm sure you can imagine, there was no way that Shan would have just left her bike in the park. She loved that bike. So something must have happened to her, which meant that she was forced to abandon her bike. Her parents just knew it. And so it was following this at around 8:30 p.m. that Friday evening when Barry and Linda Kingi went to the Noosa Heads police station and they reported their 12-year-old daughter as missing. And to be honest, immediately the police and the detectives knew that this was not looking good. They really feared that something bad must have happened to Shan. Of course, there was a chance that she was just a runaway. Maybe she had decided to just go off on her own. But realistically, the chances of that being the case were very slim. Shan was just 12 years old and she had a good life. She loved her parents, she had a lot of friends, she enjoyed school. She had no reason to have wanted to run away. And I mean, if she was going to run away, surely she would have taken her bike. Surely she would need that. The police just did not think that this was the case of a runaway kid. I think instantly they just had a gut feeling that something far more sinister had happened to Sian Kingi. This was looking like a child abduction. So the investigation into the disappearance of Sian Kingi was quickly underway. Searches of Pinaroo Park immediately began. They searched for any evidence or clues as to where Shan might have gone, but to be honest, they didn't really find anything. Several police officers were drafted in to assist with the search for Shan. They had dive teams search bodies of water nearby, and the police immediately began appealing to the public. Shan's parents themselves, Barry and Linda, did a televised appeal, and very quickly Shan's case was all over the news. The story of her disappearance spread like wildfire. In an effort to jog people's memories as to whether they may have seen Shan, they placed a mannequin, I think near where Shan was last seen. This mannequin was dressed in similar clothes as to what Shan was wearing on the day that she vanished, her school uniform. And as a result of the media coverage on this case, the police did receive many tips and leads from the public, and the local community really came together here. As soon as word spread that a child in Noosa Heads was missing, members of the public all volunteered to help look for her, and everyone was of course desperately hoping that Shan would be found alive and well and brought back home to her family. However, tragically, as it would turn out, that would not be the case, as just 6 days after she went missing, her dead body was found. On the 3rd of December 1987, an 18-year-old fruit picker named Neil Clark was walking to his place of work near Castaways Creek, which is an area located in the Timbawa Mountains State Forest in Queensland, which is called the Tewantin Forest Reserve today, I believe. It's just over 16 kilometres away from Pinaroo Park in Noosa Heads, where Shan was last seen. Anyway, Neil was walking through this area when all of a sudden he came across this absolutely foul smell. Now, according to one source, Neil had actually first noticed the smell the day before this, whilst he was on his way home from work, and the next day, the 3rd of December, he realised that the smell was even stronger. So he started looking around in the forest, trying to figure out what the source of this odour was, and quickly he discovered the answer to his question. That smell was a decomposing body. it was, of course, the body of missing Sian Kingi, and Neil immediately called the police. So detectives soon arrived at the scene. They too observed Shan's body. As I said, she was starting to decompose by this point, so it was clear that she'd been dead probably since the day that she went missing. She was lying face up in a dry creek bed. She was partially clothed. She was still wearing her school uniform, which she obviously had on the day that she disappeared. Although according to one source, her underwear had been removed and it was found not far from her body. And of course, the fact that her underwear had been taken off suggested that this crime was sexually motivated, and this was tragically confirmed during her autopsy. This 12-year-old girl had been raped by her attacker. She was raped before she was brutally murdered. It was determined that as well as being strangled, Shan had also been stabbed repeatedly with a knife. In total, she sustained 12 stab wounds to her body. I believe the majority of them were in her chest area, but she'd also been stabbed a couple of times in her neck too, and it was noted that one of her hands was almost completely severed. So we can guess that that was probably from where Shan was trying to fight back and defend herself. And these stab wounds were so deep that one of them reached her spine and 3 of them punctured her heart. I mean, it's unbelievable for someone to do that to a child. It's truly sickening. And as you can imagine, news of Shan's horrific murder not only devastated her family, but the whole country, really. The public were heartbroken for the Kingi family and so angry. What kind of monster could do this to an innocent 12-year-old little girl? Well, that's what the police now had to figure out. Now that this case had turned into a homicide investigation, they had the task of identifying the perpetrator, and quickly, because I mean, someone who is capable of doing this to a child is more than capable of doing it again, attacking someone else. So the police knew that they had to act fast to catch this sadistic killer, and thankfully, by the time Shan's body was found, the police already had some pretty promising lines of inquiry that they were pursuing. So as I mentioned earlier, news of Shan's disappearance spread very fast around Queensland, and this resulted in a number of tips and leads coming in from the public. And there were a couple of tips in particular which seemed to stand out to the police because they all seemed to be regarding the same car. The police received one report from a member of the public who said that on the afternoon of the 27th of November 1987, so the same afternoon that Shan went missing, they remembered seeing a dusty white-coloured Holden Kingswood station wagon around the area of Pinaroo Park, which, as we know, Shan was cycling through when she vanished. Now, according to their records, there were about 10,000 white-coloured Holden Kingswood station wagons registered in Queensland at this time. It was a very popular vehicle, but the police really believed that the station wagon seen at Pinaroo Park on the afternoon of Shan's disappearance may have still been related to her case because, like I said, this was not the only lead that they received about a white station wagon. They also received another one from a woman named Elizabeth and her friend Bill. Now, they were sunbathing on Castaways Creek in Queensland, around the same area where Shan's body was found, and on the afternoon that Shan vanished, they said that whilst they were sunbathing, they noticed this strange, quote, unkempt looking man walking along the beach. And apparently Elizabeth tried to smile at him as he walked past, but he didn't smile back. If anything, he just kind of glared at her. And there was just something about this man which made both Elizabeth and Bill feel really uneasy, and so they actually decided to go and check Bill's car because they'd actually been to Castaways Creek a couple of times before, and Bill had had some trouble with his car being broken into in the car park in the past. And because of this strange man, they decided that they should probably go and check the car, check that it hadn't been broken into again. So they headed back to the car park where they once again saw this strange, unkempt looking man, and as soon as he saw them, saw Elizabeth and Bill, this man immediately jumped into this white-coloured Holden Kingswood station wagon and drove away quickly. It was almost like Elizabeth and Bill had spooked him for some reason, and so because of this bizarre and shady encounter, they actually decided to jot down the license plate of this station wagon at the time. And then later, when they learned of the disappearance and, as it would turn out, out murder of Sian Kingi, and they heard that a white station wagon had been seen in Pinnaroo Park, the place where she vanished from, they decided to call the police about their own sighting of a white station wagon at Castaways Creek, just in case it could have been related. The registration plate that Elizabeth and Bill gave over was LLE 429. So the police looked this license plate up, and what they discovered was that the vehicle, the white Holden station wagon, was actually registered to a woman. Her name was Valme Beck. So the police did a bit of digging and they started looking a bit more into this Valme Beck, and what they learned was that she was married to a man named Barry Watts, who seemed to match the description of that unkempt looking man that was seen at Castaways Creek on the afternoon that Shan went missing. But that wasn't all. When the police continued looking into this couple, they discovered that they both had lengthy criminal records, and in fact it seemed as though they were on the run at the time that this case took place. They both had warrants out for their arrest. So let's talk a little bit more about them, starting with Valme Beck. So she was born in 1943, making her about 44 years old by this time in 1987. Sources state that she was neglected as a child, which resulted in her being a ward of the state, and she became involved with committing crimes from a very, very young age, right from when she was a teenager. I couldn't actually find specifically what crimes she carried out. I would imagine that it was probably mainly theft and robbery offences, and this meant that she was constantly in and out of jail from about 1961 to 1972. Valme Beck had been married a couple of times over the years. Barry Watts was actually her third husband. She'd been married twice before him, and she had 6 children from these 2 marriages. However, according to one report, she just abandoned all of her kids after her marriages broke down. And in 1983, so about 4 years before this case took place, she met Barry Watts. The two of them met at a tavern where Watts was working as a doorman at the time. Barry Watts was born in 1953, meaning that he was around 34 years old in 1987, so he was about 10 years younger than Beck. Apparently Barry was an orphan when he was a child, and as I said, he too was a criminal. He had an extensive criminal record, which included crimes such as theft, breaking and entering, and safe cracking, so breaking into a safe. And after the couple married in late 1986, Valme Beck and Barry Watts began committing crimes together. Well, actually, a lot of the time, Barry would commit crimes with one of his best friends, and Valme Beck would kind of be their lookout. So like when they were breaking into somewhere to commit a robbery, Valme would wait outside and keep watch in case anyone saw or the police arrived. But they were caught. They were both arrested in mid-1987, and they were sent to prison for several weeks for robbery and fraud offences. They were eventually released on bail. However, from what I can gather, they broke the terms of their bail by fleeing Perth in Western Australia, which is where they were living, and they started travelling to different places. Like I mentioned, they were essentially on the run. Following their release, they travelled to South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and then Queensland. They arrived in Queensland in October of 1987, just the month before Sian Kingi was abducted and killed. Apparently, whilst they were on the run, the couple would go by different names, and Valme Beck would constantly make an effort to change her appearance. She would always change the colour of her hair to obviously avoid being caught. By the time they got to Queensland, they had already acquired a new car, their white Holden Kingswood station wagon. They actually got that whilst they were travelling through Victoria, and as we know, that very car is what led to Valme Beck and Barry Watts coming onto the detectives' radar in the Sian Kingi case, because a white station wagon was seen in the area of Pinnaroo Park where Shan vanished from, and it was seen at Castaways Creek, not far from where her body was later found. And the sighting at Castaways Creek led the police to Valme Beck's registration plate. So the police began looking into this married couple as potential suspects. They wondered if maybe they could have been involved with what happened to Shan. I mean, we know that they carried out crimes together, so if Barry Watts killed Shan, could his wife have been his accomplice? Could she have helped him to carry out this heinous murder? Well, as the investigation continued, the police did seem to obtain evidence which supported this theory. As they started to receive new leads, which suggested that Barry Watts and Valme Beck had tried to abduct other young women before. They were contacted by a woman named Nicole Close. Now, Nicole worked as a nurse at the Ipswich Hospital in Queensland, and she told the police that just a few weeks before the murder of Sian Kingi, on the evening of the 10th of December 1987, she had just finished her shift at the hospital. It was very late at night, it was around 12 a.m, and after her shift ended, Nicole walked through the hospital car park towards her car. And as she was approaching her car, she noticed another vehicle, a white Holden station wagon, start driving towards her very quickly, which made Nicole nervous, so she kind of sped up and she quickly jumped into the driver's seat of her vehicle. However, as she did so, this white station wagon just pulled up and stopped kind of right in front of her car, so she was almost blocked, making it harder for her to drive away. Nicole noticed that there were two people in this white station wagon. There was a man and a woman, and as they pulled up, the man jumped out of the car and approached Nicole's driver's side window. He told Nicole that they were lost, and he asked if she could give them directions to a place that they were trying to find, and he asked Nicole if she could take a look at his map to point out the route that they needed to take. So she agreed, and whilst this man fetched his map from the car, Nicole got out of her vehicle to take a look at it. But as she did so, as she was looking at his map, Nicole recalled also looking towards the back seat of this couple's station wagon, and in the back seat she spotted a load of ropes that they had in there, which again made her feel really nervous and on edge. There was just something about this couple which was making Nicole feel really, really uncomfortable, especially because this man, as he was chatting to her about the directions, he just kept inching closer and closer and closer to Nicole. But thankfully, as this was happening, at one point another man, a member of the public, started walking near them in the car park, which seemed to startle the man asking for directions, because he kind of quickly moved away from Nicole immediately when he saw this other man walking past, and that was when Nicole jumped back into her car and she just left. She drove away from this couple immediately. Nicole really feared for her life that night. She really thought that that couple may have been trying to abduct her, and so upon receiving this lead, the police went to Nicole with a photo lineup, and within this photo lineup they had pictures of Barry Watts and Valme Beck, and immediately she picked them out as being the man and woman that she had that encounter with in the hospital car park. And Nicole's case wasn't the only attempted abduction that the police ultimately linked Beck and Watts to. They also learned of another kidnap attempt which happened just the day after this, on the 11th of November. That day, a man and a woman, once again driving a white Holden station wagon, attempted to abduct a young woman named Cheryl, who I believe worked for Target. They tried to kidnap her from a shopping centre parking lot by asking for her help with directions. However, it soon became clear that that wasn't their intention at all when the man pulled out a knife and began trying to drag Cheryl inside of their vehicle. And apparently the woman started trying to drag Cheryl by her hair to get her into the car. But thankfully, Cheryl was able to fight back. She managed to actually wrestle the knife off of the man, and during the struggle he actually cut his hand, and Cheryl was able to escape and get away. And once again, when the police did a photo lineup weeks later after Sian Kingi's disappearance, she picked out Watts and Beck as being her attackers. And in addition to that, a fingerprint on her car matched the fingerprint of Barry Watts. So evidence against them really seemed to be mounting here. Barry Watts and Valme Beck were now the top suspects in the kidnap and murder of Sian Kingi. So the police obviously needed to find them. Now, they were able to find out that whilst they were staying in Queensland, Watts and Beck had been renting a house in a town called Lowood. So they went straight to this house, but when detectives arrived, there was no sign of the couple. And I did read on one source that upon looking around the house, police discovered evidence which suggested that the couple had once again tried to disguise their appearances. So for example, they found boxes of hair dye, they found just clumps of their hair which they had cut off, and apparently they found evidence which indicated that the last time the couple were there at the house in Lowood was on the 4th of December just the day after Shan's body was discovered, it seemed as though as soon as her body was found, they decided to go on the run again. Why? What were they running from this time? So because they weren't there, the police spoke to the real estate agent who dealt with the rental of the house that Beck and Watts were staying in. And luckily the agent was able to show the police this check for the rent that the couple had mailed to them. And the check revealed that the couple were now staying in a motel in a town called The Entrance, all the way in New South Wales. So they'd made it pretty far from Queensland. So the detectives headed straight there. They headed to this motel in New South Wales and they immediately arrested Barry Watts and his wife Valme Beck. They were arrested on suspicion of the murder of Sian Kingi and also for the attempted abduction of the Target employee Cheryl. And this was on the 12th of December 1987, by the way, so only about 15 days after Shan was killed. And they were extradited back to Queensland to be interviewed by Queensland detectives. So they were taken to the police station in Queensland and their separate interviews began, and as I understand it, initially both of them kept pretty quiet. Neither Watts nor Beck would admit to any involvement in Shan's murder. But eventually, I think the detectives started to get the feeling from Valme Beck that maybe she might crack. They just had a feeling that she wanted to talk, and so they started kind of using the fact that she was a mother as a guilt trip technique almost. They were saying to her, look, you're a mum, you've got kids, and think about Sian Kingi's parents, the pain that they are going through right now. They said to Beck, imagine if Shan was your daughter. Wouldn't you want answers? Wouldn't you want to know what had happened to her? Who had done this to her? And it seemed as though this tactic used by the detectives worked, because after a couple of minutes, Valme Beck began to talk, and she confessed that yes, she and her husband Barry had carried out the abduction, rape and murder of 12-year-old Sian Kingi. And she talked them through her account of that fateful day and also kind of what had been happening in their lives in the lead up to this, how they even came to the decision between them to carry out this horrific crime. So Valme Beck would claim to the police that Barry Watts was a very abusive husband. She claimed that he had beaten her on many occasions and that he was a very, very volatile man. And she said that I think in the weeks and months before Shan's murder, Barry had been expressing to his wife about how he was having these dark, violent fantasies about schoolgirls. He was sexually attracted to young schoolgirls to the point where he would even make his wife, who was in her 40s, dress up as a schoolgirl. He would also regularly secretly watch schoolgirls whilst they were standing at bus stops, just being a general creep. But it wasn't enough for him. Just watching these children and making his wife dress up in a school uniform wasn't enough to satisfy his perverted desires. What he truly wanted was to sexually assault and abuse a young girl, a child. And he wanted his wife to help him do this, help him find a girl that he could rape and subsequently kill. Specifically, Barry Watts told his wife that he wanted to be the, quote, first and last sexual partner of a young virgin. And he promised his wife that if she helped him with this, if she helped him find a victim, then that would be it. He would have gotten it out of his system. He would have finally fulfilled this sickening fantasy of his, and then once he had, he would stop being so aggressive and he would be faithful to his wife for the rest of his life. It's been theorized that Barry probably asked Valme to help him because he knew that kidnapping a child would most likely be a hell of a lot easier if he had a woman helping him. Children kind of instinctively trust strangers a lot more if they are female rather than male, don't they? Because, you know, growing up, you're often told by parents and teachers to look out for strange men, not to go off with strange men, but you're rarely told to be wary of women too. And I think Barry knew that if he tried to abduct and lure in a child on his own, it might not work because they would be on high alert around him. But if his wife Valme was there, maybe they would trust her enough to go off with them, you know? So yeah, he asked his wife Valme to help him, and unbelievably, Valme agreed. She said that she would assist her husband in kidnapping and killing a child, literally just so that Barry wouldn't leave her. It's believed that being 10 years older than her husband, Valme was always scared that he would leave her eventually for someone a lot younger because she couldn't fully satisfy him. He liked them a lot younger and she was a lot older, and she was scared that he was going to leave her, and she didn't want that. She didn't want to lose him. She would do anything that she could to keep him, even carry out a murder, apparently. And on the morning of the 27th of November 1987, Valme told police that her husband woke up and he whispered to his wife, quote, "Today is the day." Today was the day that they were going to find a little girl that they could kill. So they got into their white station wagon and they headed to Noosa in search for a victim. They were just driving around looking for someone that caught Barry's eye, and eventually they found themselves parked up in Pinneroo Park. They just sat in the car waiting in the park for a while, and then they got out and just stood by the car looking around until eventually Barry spotted someone. He spotted 12-year-old Sian Kingi, who, as we know, was cycling through the park on her way home from shopping with her mum, and Barry immediately decided that Shan was his perfect victim. She was young, she was a child, as we know. She was wearing a school uniform because she had been to school that day, so he immediately told Valme that Shan was the one, and he instructed his wife to stop the young girl, which she did. Valme called Shan over and she told her that she had lost her dog. It was a little white poodle with a pink bow and it had gone missing, and she asked Shan if she wouldn't mind helping them look for him, and Shan, being the kind person that she was, agreed. However, of course, this was just a way for the couple to lure Shan in and distract her, because just moments after this, Barry Watts went up behind Shan and he grabbed her. He gagged Shan to stop her from screaming, and then he dragged her into the back seat of their station wagon where she was bound with masking tape. Barry stayed in the back seat with Shan and he kept her head down whilst Valme started the car and began driving away. The couple had successfully kidnapped their victim. Valme drove the car to the Timbawa State Forest, which, as we know, was about 16 kilometres away from Pinneroo Park. And when they reached a part of the forest that was very quiet and remote and there was no one else around, they pulled Shan out of the car and ordered her to lay down on a bedspread that Barry had put on the ground. And it was then when she was raped repeatedly by Barry Watts. The fear that Shan must have felt is just unimaginable. 12 years old. She was just a 12-year-old innocent little girl. It's horrendous to think about how terrified she must have been. Apparently, in her confession, Valme said that Shan, quote, "never cried, never shed a tear, a brave little girl, never uttered a peep. She just did everything he told her." After Barry Watts was satisfied, after he had assaulted Shan a number of times, he then proceeded to strangle her and stab her to death. As we discussed earlier, he stabbed her 12 times in a truly vicious attack. Now, in her confession, Valme Beck kind of tried to separate herself from the rape and murder part of this crime as much as she could. She claimed that she had no part in raping or killing Shan and that she just waited by the car whilst her husband did that. The detectives weren't so convinced that that truly was the case. They believed that she probably had more involvement than she was letting on, but that's what she claimed in her account anyway. After Shan was dead, the couple moved her body to another location in the forest. They just dumped her in that dry creek bed. They got back in their car and then they just left. And from here, they got rid of the evidence. Valme said that before returning home, they threw the murder weapon, the knife, into a lake in Noosa called Lake MacDonald. And alongside the knife, they also threw the bedspread, some rope, a bout, and masking tape into the water too, which was all later recovered by the police. After they disposed of this evidence, they went home, spent the evening watching television, and Valme also told the detectives that she and her husband had sex that same night. Clearly, neither of them were sickened by what they had done. They got off on it. Neither of them felt any kind of remorse or guilt for having just brutally murdered a child. But yeah, anyway, that was Valme Beck's confession. Now, as I mentioned, Barry Watts would not say anything to the police. He refused refused to answer any questions or admit his guilt. And when he found out that his wife and accomplice had confessed, boy was he angry. He was furious that she had caved in, essentially. He wanted them to both take this secret to the grave and never admit to this crime. So the fact that Valme had gone against that so quickly, he was very, very angry with her. Now, whilst the couple were in custody as the police were building their case against them, the detectives actually came up with a little plan to put Valme and Barry in two cells which were very close to each other. So I think what they did was they had Barry in one cell, then the cell next to his was empty, and then Valme was in the cell next to the empty one. So they were very close together. And without their knowledge, the detectives set up secret recording devices in the cells. What they were hoping was that Valme and Barry would speak to each other when there were no police around. Maybe they would speak about Shan's murder, and then the police would have this as additional evidence. And it would be particularly useful evidence when prosecuting Barry Watts for this crime, because of course they didn't have a confession from him like they did from Valme Beck, and it worked. The couple did talk about Shan's murder. Valme told her husband about the fact that she had told the police everything, she'd confessed. And according to one article I came across, Barry Watts was even heard on the recordings saying to his wife that he, quote, wanted to do it again. He wanted to kill again. Something else that the detectives heard on these recordings was Barry Watts actually trying to convince his wife to kill herself in her prison cell because of her confession. I mean, he wasn't stupid. He knew full well that her confession would be a damning piece of evidence against him during an upcoming trial. But he thought that if Valme killed herself before they went to court, then her confession would be thrown out. It would be deemed inadmissible during his trial, and therefore he had a better chance of getting away with this crime. So yeah, he was literally trying to persuade his wife to commit suicide. But she didn't, and just a couple of days after they were arrested, the couple were both charged with the abduction, rape and murder of Sian Kingi. And as you can imagine, when news of their arrests and charges spread, the community were absolutely infuriated. They were sickened that they had these two monsters living amongst them, especially because one of them was a woman who was literally a mother to 6 children herself. The fact that a mother of all people can do something like this, can just callously take the life of a young child alongside her husband, is almost impossible to comprehend. I mean, it's impossible to imagine how anyone, man or woman, could commit a crime such as this, but for a mother, it was absolutely shocking. It rocked the community. I mean, the public was so angry that they were calling for Barry Watts and Valme Beck to be executed for what they had done. As the couple were taken into court for their committal hearing, I believe it was, literally hundreds of people gathered outside to shout and scream abuse at them. They held up banners and signs calling for their deaths. I think I saw one which read, quote, no air for the pair, and they hung nooses off of poles and street lights. They wanted to see this evil couple hanged. Both Valme Beck and Barry Watts went to trial separately for Shan's murder, and whilst Barry Watts pleaded not guilty to all of his charges, his wife pleaded guilty to the abduction and rape of Shan, but not guilty to her murder. However, thankfully, at the end of their trials, they were both convicted of all charges and each given a life sentence for the murder charge. And for the abduction and rape charges, Valme Beck received an additional 3 and 10-year sentence, and Barry Watts received an additional 3 and 15-year sentence. It was, of course, more than likely that neither of them would ever get out of prison. Thank God. But that is not where this case ends. You see, after Barry Watts was sent to prison, it actually emerged that he had been confessing and boasting to his fellow inmates about another murder that he had committed, the murder of a young woman named Helen Feeney. Helen Feeney was a young mother and a trainee teacher from Brisbane, and she was just 31 years old when she suddenly vanished on the 29th of October 1987. Just 2 weeks after Barry Watts and Valme Beck arrived in Queensland after fleeing Western Australia, and less than a month before Sian Kingi was kidnapped and killed. Helen Feeney's car was found just abandoned in a car park in Castledean, which is a suburb in Brisbane, and one of the windows of her car was smashed, leading detectives to believe that she had been attacked and abducted in the car park and probably murdered. However, her body was never found. But as I said, it was after Barry Watts went to prison for Shan's murder when detectives were informed that he had been boasting behind bars about how he had killed Helen Feeney too, and how he had essentially gotten away with her murder. They might have caught him for Shan's, but they hadn't caught him for Helen's. Of course, the police knew that they wouldn't get a confession to Helen Feeney's murder from Barry Watts himself directly, and so they turned to his wife, Valme Beck, while she was behind bars for help. They asked Valme if her husband had ever confessed to her that he had killed Helen, and she claimed that he had. She told detectives that Barry Watts killed Helen when she caught him trying to break into her car in that car park in Castle Dean, hence why her window was smashed. Valme said that she didn't see the murder of Helen taking place herself. However, she said that she did later see a red blanket in the boot or the trunk of their car with light coloured hair sticking out from under it, and it was clear to her that that was the body of the woman that Barry had murdered. That was the body of Helen Feeney. Valme also claimed that her husband asked her to help him dispose of the body of Helen, but that she refused to, and so he did that alone. And she believed that he had buried her in a shallow grave somewhere in the town of Lowood in Queensland. However, to this day, Helen Feeney's remains have never been recovered. But despite this, the police still decided to go ahead and charge Barry Watts with Helen Feeney's murder. This was in 1995, so 8 years after her disappearance. But unfortunately, during the trial, it was established that there just wasn't enough evidence to convict him because they didn't have Helen's body. And so he was found not guilty, which is just heartbreaking for Helen's family, isn't it? Not just the fact that her body has never been found and they've never been able to give her a funeral and a burial, but because her suspected killer essentially got away with it. I mean, he was behind bars for life anyway for the murder of Shan, so it wouldn't have made much of a difference in terms of his prison time, I guess. But I can imagine that for them to have had that closure of a conviction in Helen's case would have just meant so much. So it's awful that they never got that. According to reports, the police did interview Barry Watts again in 2007, so 2 decades after Shan and Helen were killed. And whilst in this interview, he did finally admit to his involvement in Sian Kingi's murder, he still refused to officially confess to Helen's murder too, and he refused to give up the location of her body because he was worried that being known as a serial killer would ruin all his chances of ever being granted parole. Barry Watts remains in prison to this day. Today he is around 71 years old and he has tried to apply for parole. However, a bill passed in 2021 named after Shan called Shan's Law essentially prevented this from happening. Shan's Law was passed in a bid to keep the worst of the worst killers locked up for as long as possible by making it possible for the parole board in Queensland to deny serial killers and child murderers from applying for parole either indefinitely or I think for at least 10 years beyond their eligibility date. So if I'm understanding that correctly, Shan's Law means that if a child murderer like Barry Watts is denied parole, a decision can be made for him to either never be allowed to apply for parole again, or at least he can apply for another 10 years rather than being able to apply every single year and, you know, putting families of victims through that trauma of having to go through parole hearings year in, year out. And yeah, Barry Watts was denied parole in 2021, so prison is where he remains to this day. He's been incarcerated for about 37 years now. As for Valme Beck, let's talk about her time in prison. So she officially divorced Barry Watts just 3 years after Shan's murder in 1990, and apparently she was repeatedly attacked in prison by other inmates because obviously she was a child killer, and child killers and child rapists are right at the bottom of the hierarchy in prison, as they should be. They are despised by the other inmates. So yeah, she was always a target for violence, and in fact in one attack she was hit in the head with a tin can in a sock, which apparently caused permanent nerve damage on one side of her head, and because of these attacks she did have to be moved to another prison. I think she was originally sent to Brisbane prison before being moved to the Townsville Townsville Correctional Centre in Queensland. According to one source, while she was behind bars, she got into another relationship with a man named Robert John Farden, who was a convicted rapist. She also became very religious. She became a Christian, and apparently at one point she was even in the same prison as Catherine Burney, another infamous female killer in Australia, who carried out the murders of 4 young women alongside her husband David Burney in 1986. I actually covered the case of David and Catherine Burney on my channel last year, so if you haven't seen that and you would like to learn more about their horrendous crimes, I will leave that video linked in the description box. But yeah, Valme Beck spent some time in the same prison as Catherine Burney. I'm actually unsure if this was before or after she was sent to prison for Shan's murder, because obviously we know that she was in and out of prison before she and Barry killed Shan for other offences. But at some point she was in the same prison as Catherine Burney and they became acquainted with one another. And Valme Beck would later go on to claim that Catherine Burney had told her that having sex with her partner David whilst they were literally murdering a young woman was, quote, the greatest thrill of all. Valme Beck did try to apply for parole a couple of times over the years, I believe. However, every single time she was rejected. And at one point she actually changed her name. She changed her name from Valme Beck to Faye Crum, probably because everyone in Australia knew the name Valme Beck and knew about what she had done. By 2008, Valme Beck had spent about 21 years in prison and she was not doing well. She was in her 60s and her health had started to decline. She was struggling with shortness of breath, and so she actually had to have surgery on her heart, but this surgery did not go to plan and she actually went into a coma after it and never woke up. Valme Beck passed away on the 27th of May 2008. At the time she was 64 years old, and that concludes this case. That is the heartbreaking case of Sian Kingi. I don't really know how to sum up my thoughts on this case, to be honest. What an absolutely horrendous crime. I know I said this earlier, but to think about the sheer terror that Shan must have experienced at the hands of these evil monsters is horrific. And at just 12 years old, she didn't even reach her teenage years. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them in the comments below, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box too if you would like to go through that. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.